All right, I've got a full conversation I had with multiple people, um, and it's going to be basically my worldview and solutions to the nihilistic decline of the West. Um, it's a very Elizabethan and Victorian England, the first Elizabeth, um, worldview. It's not fascist, it's not Nazi, but I'm riffing off of some of the principles of the third world and past imperialism, with a more soft, friendly, um, traditional European pre totalitarianism, but still chauvinistic worldview. Um, it's basically an all out, full frontal, all out, all fronts attack on the things that are causing our people, pain and suffering. Um, Now, I'm just going to mention four fundamentals before we get started that drive a lot of this, the second half of my reasoning and so on. And that is, one can only sacrifice, waste, or equivalent exchange, which means upgrade, downgrade, or side grade. One can, an individual, an organism, genetics of any sort, rely on feeding from the external environment, including other organisms or genes, to survive. One is always in advance or retreat by default, with stalemates and neutrality as either a temporary blip, a pause in the decline or growth of a people or individual, or more often, or more importantly, a byproduct of the switch between advance and retreat or shrink and grow. The fourth fundamental is that there are always more men than women in the world, with exception to when we were killing each other in warfare more often. Therefore, there's always going to be incels somewhere in the world, and I think it's better that it's the other people's, not our people's, because I'm part of our people, not their people. And fundamentally, the expansionism that I'm going to promote in the second half of this video is ultimately a bit of a sort of tragic necessity for the health of our people, if we don't want to suffer unreasonably. There is a judgment of the value of our people genetically and culturally over other people's, but I'm not looking to eradicate their genetics. I'm looking to dilute their genetics, which seems kind of nasty in a way, except you have to remember that the Western European or European population of our genetics is a grand total of 9% of the world. And if we dilute the 91% from with the 99%, then it's more equitable genetic distribution. And basically, I'm ripping off the mass immigration and globalist treatment of us and saying, why don't we do it to them instead? And there's a assumption that we maintain our genetic and cultural purity at home and export our genes by race mixing, not genocide, but by race mixing abroad and keeping purity at home. And we export our cultural artifacts abroad to mix with theirs in their own homelands. Not through warfare, but through economic incentives for taking our people in, who I believe, and this is an assumption, but I'm willing to gamble on it being true, that roughly speaking, on average, our genetics are more functional on average than their genetics in a technological society. They're better acclimated towards the natural environment of their areas, but for some reason our environment led to technological society and like the Industrial Revolution and all that stuff. And now that we have technological society, it's also an environmental aspect, not just the weather and climate, or fauna or flora, like plants and animals. So, the upshot of us doing it to them instead of them doing it to us is that whatever genetics exist, even if they're diluted in intensity of the population, because technological society will be better served genetically and culturally by us, their genetics will actually expand because of the sheer volume of people who can live with better living conditions. And the presumption is that Lebensraum, genetic purges of the population to move our people into their places, which the Nazis did, is very bad. And the cultural impositions alone are also bad because they flop. Because democratization of Iraq led to problems that can't be sustained, like a problematic situation that couldn't be sustained in Afghanistan as well, which is why Iraq was a failure and Afghanistan was a failure, and so on. And by race mixing, we're making their population more like ours instead of them making our population more like theirs, and we're better off in a technological society than they are in their level of technological society. So, and part of that is foundational by the foundation of the genetics, not just the culture. Because something like, I think it's Liberia, imported directly the American Constitution as an experiment in Africa, and it's an absolute hellhole. So the cultural imposition alone is not good enough. You need a certain degree of the genetic dispositions and biological predispositions to suffuse the population in general to sustain the cultural advancements. But I'm also going to specify that their native local genetics have certain strengths and weaknesses and value that I do not want to eliminate. I just want to introduce our strengths to them. Now there is a certain degree of mean-spiritedness in this, like the whole revenge for mass immigration by mass immigrationing them from us. That is very potential. That might be a motivator and a driver in me that's unrecognized. Or at least partially recognized, I guess. I kind of recognize it, but at the same time it's like, I think we would actually make them better off if they're a little more like us. Not entirely like us, but a little more like us. And the motivation is a lingua, culture, and genus franca, which means a common language, culture, and gene pool, at least existing, not being the only one, but existing throughout the world. Sort of like how English is the common language, I would put Anglo culture and Anglo genetics as the common genetics worldwide, or Western European genetics and culture and language, the common stuff worldwide, or English as the common language, and culture and genetics as European, basically, because that's the 9% group out of the 91%. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation, and it starts with bashing materialism and extends from there to some metaphysical arguments, and then to a strategic plan to expand our society to prevent collapse and retreat instead of advancement, because neutrality and stalemate is a temporary position, and if one is always retreating, then they lose everything eventually no matter what, and if one's advancing, then they gain things. And I want my people, because they're my people, to advance, not retreat all the time like they're doing right now. And I'm totally fine with some give and take over the years and ages and so on, where we advance into them and then they advance into us, and then we advance into them and they advance into us, and so on. Some ebb and flow, give and take of this whole set of principles. But I think we're in a very ebb and receive situation at the moment, and it's kind of painful, and I prefer an advance and give movement and direction again for our people. So basically what I say is, just thought I'd drop these here. Materialist being rather specific to those who don't believe in justice, love, or beauty, possibly even truth. Materialism is like a yeast infection. It is the very spirit of devouring until there's no food left in a finite system, while promising redistribution as a stalling tactic to prevent us from recognizing the need to expand humanity to the stars. It's one big inferno, not infinite campfires. The materialist knows Earth is finite. That's why they always sabotage their local population, thinking they will get more. Then they feel guilty, so fetishize helping the other populations take over the locals. Pure first order consequences, never second, third, or fourth level consequences understanding. The blind materialist lens says that one must try to game the system at every turn to their benefit, every interaction, and is short-sighted and destructive to everyone, including the holder. It's the psychopath or sociopath, Marxist and secularist lens, and burns up civilizational capital. Where is it? Someone started the conversation after I posted those. Materialism as in everything can be measured, or as in get bling, is what they asked. And I say one tends to lend to the other almost exclusively. You can measure bling, stuff, or property. You can measure roughly clout, views, likes, subscribers. You can't measure justice, beauty, or love. Truth is a little more tricky in regards to those things, which one it is, and so on. He said he doesn't think I comprehend either. I retorted, you don't think. I comprehend both. The people that assume only measured stuff matters are the most obsessive with fame, fortune, pleasure, and power. The four idols that lead to degradation of character and goodness if allowed to run amok. To be good, you still have to have quote-unquote higher values that aren't measurable. It's the reason sophists are looked down on, and philosophers or philosophy are looked favorably on to some extent. One claims to be wise enough already, one claims to love wisdom, so is always chasing it. The difference between quote-unquote I'm perfect and quote-unquote I'm improving. Then they say the materialist argument is that you can measure everything in the material world. Materialists would argue that by obtaining a sufficient understanding of neurobiology, we would be able to know and measure exactly what love is, or the exact cognitive mechanisms behind what humans perceive to be justice. Then I said, let me know when Maxwell's demon and entropy doesn't prevent the viewer from understanding themselves well without embodiment and with pure conceptualization then. Hence, age brings wisdom more often than youth. The only thing not subject to entropy is infinity, by the way. Hence, God is fully sufficient on his own as he is infinite. Feel free to doubt if he's a person in any real sense or exists, though. Reality is often counterintuitive and tricky, which is why we don't automatically know everything. Some novelty and lots of stability is the best feeling. Also, growth in capacity or depth of meaning. Think the creative endeavor, challenging oneself or getting into a manic episode, working on constructing something advanced compared to your normal situation that you're actually capable of, but requires a little effort as it's got some challenge, but not so much you give up. Pulling off something you couldn't do before, or going where no man has gone before. They didn't see how a thought experiment about entropy has to do with embodiment or pure conceptualization. And I said embodiment solves this object-subject divide, or subject-object divide between potential and actuality with free will and determinism, both arguing logically or experientially versus logically that they're the primary. So object, actuality, determinism being logical, but subjective, potential, and free will being experienced. It's why AI has to physically have similar structure to brains to match our quote-unquote spark of existence, and why the Turing test might be passed to the unknowing observer, but there'll always be a tell of some sort, and why things are things and not other things. Then they say, what does the second statement have to do with the first statement? And I say, AI doesn't embody the brain, thus it is not the brain. It is a simpler in construction, and therefore lacks the potential of the biological brain. When would the conversation turn to AI? You could build an AI server that has as much data processing as a brain, and it still lacks something of a crucial spark and organization of the data a human brain has, thus embodiment. It also explains why emergent properties are so difficult to justify or explain outside of noticing the pattern. And quite frankly, paradoxes are also existent. Chicken and egg in evolution, ship of Theseus, being and becoming, image and object. Like the painting of this is not a pipe, which is a picture of a pipe, or a painting of a pipe. That's not an actual pipe, but in a very simple understanding of it, you say that's a pipe. You just go, oh, that's a pipe. You don't say a painting of a pipe. You just go, oh, it's a pipe. Normally. Yeah. One's a little autistic about it, whereas one's kind of normal about it. And we can't resolve them, only notice them at the base level of our understanding. Embodiment explains why, by standardization of a sorts, why we are all subjective but can communicate objectively, why language exists even, or even across species with what a growl means. They said they're incapable of extrapolating, or I'm dragging together a bunch of tangentially related topics to create the illusion of having made a point. Then I basically say I had a midlife crisis 7 years ago and focused on these things, and I've got reasonable giftedness intellectually, and I'm slightly idiot savant for these things and so on. Natural at deconstructing every concept, and then it makes me a little better on average to reconstruct the concept from the ground up, and so on. And I had a lot of motivation to do so because of my midlife crisis, and so on. And then I say, if it's beyond you, don't worry about it. It's the big stoner thoughts, except I was sober. It's not that important to most people to function day to day, by the way. Some people don't need, and some people do need to deconstruct everything possible, then reconstruct the mental map to function decently. Their issue is that what I brought up doesn't have any hard connections between any of those concepts. They share some terms, but that's about it. And then I asked, are you a materialist? Because these are the highest resolution map to all the aspects that go beyond materialist conceptualization of the world. And then they say, not entirely, but they're sympathetic to that worldview. And then I say, exactly, materialism isn't deep. These are deep. They run through all existence, force one to think on a higher dimension. Brain teasers to exercise the muscle that is the brain, more integrated thoughts, second, third, fourth order consequences. I know that sounds vaguely guru-like, but it's the best explanation I have, and I'm not charging for anything or hiding the particulars. Also, I'm not saying you'll be magically smarter for having considered these. People can operate just fine without worrying about it if they're not the type to be able to handle it. It's for people that have mental potential with no instincts. Sort of the pickup artist tricks taught to you for those without natural charisma, without their own natural inborn sense of game, so to speak, to pick up women. Very handy if you're questioning everything to have a ready-made map of what is solid foundationally to the universe. They are aware of the concepts, they just don't see what it has to do with materialism. They're quote-unquote above materialism. Prerequisites in instinct or study to function better than a sociopath or psychopath. And they asked if we're working with the same definition. And then I say yes. The answer to your conundrum is that different personalities exist and dispositions biologically, coming back to embodiment. Some people lack the instincts and have mental capacity to form a mental map or conceptualization, but without the work or someone teaching it, lack what others naturally have functionally. It's a linear warriors, quadratic wizards, early or late bloomer situation. Because those with instincts rarely get into the details because it just works, trademark, TM. Those without have to painstakingly map every detail of the territory and fit everything into their mind coherently, on purpose. So a form of specialized conscious expertise emerges in those who study versus those who just start with it. And then I post the image on my screen right now. While you were out there eating trash, I studied the blade. If you check out Homath's levels of thinking, you'll begin to see how IQ and its potential, or lack of developing the potential, operates in regards to materialist and versus quote-unquote higher concepts. Then you should notice how things get more abstract in the higher the level of thinking. Then they say things getting more abstract, the more one thinks about thinking isn't an argument against materialism. And then I say, then let me put it simply. If you are a base animal with no understanding other than food, sex, shitting, pissing, and playing, you're not a fully developed human. At best, you're at the level of a toddler or infant, if you're human even. See also Kierkegaard's aesthetic, ethical, and religious spheres of life, or the 2000s secularized man-children bleeding into the games journalists becoming activists, bleeding into Jordan Peterson's re-enchantment of the world, quote-unquote, the Bible studying. So you have the aesthetic, which means like food, drink, video games, the secularized man-children of the 2000s, the ethical, the woke activism of the games journalists, and the re-enchantment, the religious sphere. Coupled with the collapse, dark ages, and return to civilization, and the culture's golden age in the 2000s, the woke age in the 2010s and some of the 2020s, and now this one, the return to civilization, so to speak, where we're struggling to regain the artistic and cultural merit we once had. Then I post another thing, which is, according to Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this is coming from Brave, but it's based on a quote specifically, if humans were showered with every blessing to the point where they only slept, ate cakes, and busied themselves with the continuation of the species, they would eventually go mad from boredom. Dostoevsky argued that out of sheer ingratitude and sheer spite, humans would intentionally play nasty tricks on themselves, others, or the world, to disrupt this perfect stagnation and introduce some form of conflict or disturbance. This concept highlights the human duality of desire. While comfort and leisure are appealing, humans inherently seek challenge, struggle, and growth. Without these elements, existence becomes a dull hum, quote unquote, that leads to resentment, prompting individuals to poke the sleeping dragon or create trouble just to feel alive and engaged with their surroundings. And then I also say, that's the quote. Then I also say, and comfort leads to laziness very strongly, which leads to collapse of higher-minded virtues and thoughts, or principles, or concepts, which leads to collapse of high-trust societies because the driving force, the animating force central to the quality of relations between people and operations of day to day and the novelty of exploring the universe don't give, or it becomes too hard because people neglect their mental, cultural muscles. And then they said, what does Mouse Utopia experiment have to do with materialism? Then I say, because the Mouse Utopia is literally the experiment that satisfied materialism's every goal, and watched the carnage unfold from it. Then they say materialism has no end goal. Neither of them do. And I say then it's just nihilism, however you slice it, and therefore it goes to Mouse Utopia regardless. And they say nihilism isn't about being given free food or housing. Then I say nihilism is the goals you can quote unquote make for yourself. They're ephemeral and subjective, or very passing, like this too shall pass kind of thing. Very Ecclesiastes kind of nihilism of nothing is permanent, nothing matters. Seeking the objective good and quote-unquote highest spirit is what makes the map I gave at first so important and the only way out of hell on earth. Finally, I don't make the rules, which is why I said quote-unquote the goals you can quote-unquote make for yourself. I only recognize the rules. Don't ask me why it's this way. I haven't thought it out. You're arguing based off inaccurate pop culture descriptions, is what they said. Then I say, which is why God is so important. So there's something to explain in a relational way, like a personal way, why the world works mechanically and structurally and physically the way it does, that respects that we're people, not just rocks, without relying on our own finite or finitude to justify objective reality and infinity. What you ascribe to nihilism is existentialism, and that is what they say. And then I say, I've heard Sartre and Camus and Nietzsche. They're still nihilistic. They just put a mask on it. It's either the undiscovered country into infinity on all levels, or a finite world where entropy or meaninglessness is king. A pithy way to put it is Christ or chaos. Someone then responded, is it better to rule in hell or serve in heaven? Then I said that's the materialist, nihilist, or pagan leading to Christian standard, respectively. And then they said probably they just like the question, and you can tell a lot about someone based on how they answer it. Then I say, notice that when you quote-unquote debunk myths of a civilization on technicalities, the civilization or tribe will simply lay down and die while the food's within easy reach, like arm's length. Like we've seen tribes actually do this in like the Amazon when they're introduced to modernity. So it's like actually like it's a real phenomenon, and that's why they don't contact those uncontacted tribes anymore, because if they do and they culture shock them with modernity, they'll literally just starve themselves to death out of despair that their entire world apparently doesn't mean anything. And they say life isn't worth living without something to live for, something greater than yourself. And I say, as a bit of a joke, that's the crux of it. And the crux is like crucifixion, the cross, stuff like that basically, but also like the central point. And then I say, quote unquote, follow God first, and then all other goods will be thrown into the mix for you on top of it. Then they say they're just following him because they've seen where the other path goes and it's not good. And I say there's nothing more worthwhile than serving infinity. It includes all the things you love on a human level. God is not a stingy bastard to those who love him. The problem isn't wanting more. The problem is not pruning the dysfunctional. And the individual I was talking to first said that in regards to debunking things leads to tribes suiciding by starvation out of despair. They say that is the product of improved conditions, not the debunking. Man can struggle on as long as there is sufficient suffering to keep him tied to the present and motivated. And then the second person I was talking to said, hee hee, more, I'd be happy not losing what I have. And then I say, refer to the second paragraph of what I copy-pasted of what Dostoevsky said in regards to the product of improved conditions argument. And then I also respond to the second person who said, hee hee, which is gratitude is also important, of course. Lack of it is dysfunctional, but wanting more isn't a problem. Wanting more than what you deserve from other people is dysfunctional. That's why it's important to get better to deserve more from other people. However, God himself is an abundant supplier who needs no one, so only gives because he wants us to have. This is why it's right to expand humanity's domain to the stars and receive from the universe in gratitude God's bountiful offerings of all the goods in the universe, and then multiply ourselves, which is a commandment, by the way. Go forth and multiply. This is assuming life is good and death is an evil of sorts. Then they say and then the second person I was talking to says, you say that, but death is a part of life. Without death, there is stagnation. And then I say, I correct him a little bit which is, without death in a finite existence, there is stagnation. A limited existence, there is stagnation. Hence the Bible promises in heaven, in infinity and eternity, where death doesn't exist and isn't needed, because you never run out of exploration and novelty and learning and growth. And then they say they're only talking about death in our current paradigm. Then I say, I don't want Warhammer 40k perpetuals, vampires, millennia long living undead, or anything like that. I don't want to be one of them myself in our material universe, this known universe that we have, not the spiritual domain. And then they were talking about the social stagnation of not the effects of individuals so much. Imagine if you're stuck with the same artists, writers, musicians for centuries. You'd never get a promotion because the guy above you never retired. And then I say society is made up of individuals interconnectedly. And then they say, and they add on top of their previous statement, and wealth and power would slowly be accrued by a select few individuals since death is a kind of natural redistribution method. Then I said, you're right. It would look like Altered Carbon, A Hellish Nightmare, or Bilbo with the One Ring of Power talking to Gandalf about feeling stretched on his 111th birthday, or 111th birthday, or a species of golems. They agree that Altered Carbon probably did a good vision of how it would operate. Then I say, without some sort of domain to expand into, one feels trapped and is willing to make life harder for themselves just to have something to do while in the cage. Then the first person I was arguing with, as opposed to the person I was discussing with, the second person I was discussing with, the first person I was arguing with, comes back with another statement. The first person I was arguing with comes back with another statement and said the Dostoevsky second paragraph, the one about explaining that people want comfort and security, but they also want challenge and novelty as well, posits that it is comfort that causes collapse. The debunking is a byproduct of the conditions that enable collapse. having the resources and time to sit around thinking about entirely useless and unproductive stuff for an excessively long time. One must also ask who would seek to debunk the foundation myths. Those who do so must have been severed from the benefits of that foundation, which means that either the elite has grown so strong that they are unaccountable to greater society, or the middle class has grown an excessive number of bureaucrats in dead weight. And then I respond, that's why I said comfort leads to laziness, which leads to lack of higher thoughts, and also mentioned the expansion of one's domain thing just now. It's not high-minded thoughts that are the problem. It's that laziness about them sets in. Mistakes are made and the rot begins because one says good enough. Of course, this is an emphasis thing. You can't think everything and you will think at least something. So it's not you have no thoughts or all the thoughts. There's a spectrum to it. The collapse is relative. We're not a Stone Age tribe wiped out. We're an advanced civilization with demographic issues and ideological disruption. That's why successive collapses are less bad most often than the previous one, or at least on average. Slowly we're growing in complexity and resilience with multiple contingencies or emergencies planned for, or at least resistance to individual types of catastrophe is developed experimentally, then refined through field testing, and life gets better on average, even with its ups and downs. Old mechanisms of survival and thriving might decay, but new ones in the breadth and depth of our developmental abilities ensures resilience with our technological level here and now. And then I mentioned I've been struggling against the collapse of civilization for 13 or 17 years, depending on whether you include my 4 years of wokeness or just the anti-woke stage, and predicted it about 23 years ago. Then they respond with my high-minded thoughts are not the problem thing with, if someone's existence is subsidized simply because they have high-minded thoughts, then that is an issue with the civilization's priorities. To which I correct them, it's potentially, highly potentially a problem, because it doesn't touch base. As they say, keep your feet on the ground and your head in the clouds. The third world doesn't tend to have high-minded thoughts. The West has too many disembodied high-minded thoughts. And then I add, nihilism and savagery are very common in both societies, respectively. So nihilism in the West and savagery in the third world, in the same way that I think it was Plato that said warriors are idiots if they're not also scholars, and scholars are cowards if they're not also warriors. As for me, I'm an INTP, very high-minded, concept-brained and deconstruction-brained, but I had a very strong upbringing in the ways of working with hands and getting into dirt and compost and woodworking and stuff like that, and getting into physical fights, right? So I've got a very embodied upbringing while being a very conceptual and ephemeral, high-minded individual naturally. So I got some balance going on. And then I say video games are interesting because they can go either way primarily. Like high-minded, abstract or concrete thinking. Oh yeah, I said you want strength of mind in abstract and concrete thinking. And video games can go either which way, basically. And then someone adds, what if their existence is subsidized despite them being close to medically retarded? And then the person I was arguing with says, if they or their predecessor were productive before they reached that point and extracted little from the greater structure, then it can be argued that society has a debt to pay back. Otherwise, you shouldn't subsidize them. And then I was talking about the video games for a second here, which is reflexes, coordination, tactical strategic thinking, ordering a character build, right? Like there's two concrete things and there's two abstract things next. And then I respond to what they said about the subsidizing or not subsidizing the disabled, which is, I said, sorry, not a fan of starving the disabled, I'm not a eugenicist, which coincidentally originates with progressive materialists. And then they say, you understand that lower IQ is a predictor for higher birth rates. The incentive structure you propose will be damaging to society in the long run. To which I offer and this is where it gets into the strategy from the cultivation and metaphysics principles into a strategy that is potentially aggressive, which I explained in the beginning of this whole thing with my principles. And then I say the appropriate angle is to subsidize them to a small degree of comfort, but not to the point they can reproduce successfully, except if they combine with another for a single child. And then there'll be some sacrifice or deprivation compared to otherwise for them. Thus you recoup or regain some of the most capable genetics of people with a bad overall set on average. However, an otherwise disabled person who can manage limited finances that effectively to have a child and have some comfort with very limited finances surely has good genetics as well as bad. Then the third person comes in and says if you subsidize them a little, they will have multiple kids, then complain if they don't get enough free stuff, and empathetic morons will relent and give them endless free stuff. And then the first person I was arguing with says your angle can't be obtained in reality. There will always be masses of bleeding heart upper middle class urbanites who will grant them far more resources than needed to escape the quote unquote oppression of the evil government. Then I suggested 3 solutions, which are to be taken as a whole. And by the way, this is only a suggestion. We don't have to go down this route as I'm going down it. This is just a concept idea, but it does get a little harsh in some ways. But I don't want to go full eugenics or something like that at all. Like, I don't want that at all. I don't consider the reasoning behind my third point of this paragraph that I'm going to describe to be eugenics. I'm going to be considering it basic justice standpoint, not a eugenics driven standpoint. 3 solutions in tandem I'd suggest is taxpayers only get the vote, so only taxpayers get the vote. All the stuff we've been talking about as cultural structure and social technology, and implementing a strict policy of subsidization where if one has more than one kid, as a disabled couple, it gets taken to adoption, the second one does. And if they abuse the system to pump out kids after a certain number, they get forcibly sterilized. Exceptions can be carved out if it's 2 disabled that come together after splitting from the other parent of their children, or if someone's physically disabled after productivity enough to afford their own kids up to the point of their current children. Someone said that option wouldn't be available, the whole thing, because people scream it's the second coming of Hitler because we closed our border. Then I say the same people that don't even want one child, let demographics have their way. Well, the white ones anyways. Simply cut off the white ones' recruitment and out-reproduce the white ones that would scream that, kick out the minorities that are illegally immigrating, and shut the borders of most legal immigration, a lot, like almost all of it, if not all of it, from the third world, and let the breeding patterns do the rest. We can do this by degrees to get people used to the idea. Then the first person who was arguing with said women are excessively empathetic and will likely vote to give them more stuff, and there's a massive chunk of spineless men who can be manipulated by women to vote the same. And then I say, which leads to another solution. Push the Overton window of ideas from retreat into expansion of our domain genetically and culturally. Positive vision for the West to conquer the world and then the stars, and enrich the other races and civilizations with ourselves. Genes alone is Nazi, culture alone is Afghanistan or Iraq, both at the same time as Victorian imperialism. Let feminism collapse as our spare men simping for the woman dries up by them going abroad to foreign women, forcing the woman to become higher quality again. Export our undesirables to the rest of the world. Our lowest should be about their medium or something. Then I say it's untenable. Then I say let hypergamy in the foreign woman abroad enable our genes to carry forwards abroad. And thus we return to potential and actuality and embodiment versus conceptualization, or quote unquote not with that attitude, in response to what they say being untenable. It even bribes the leftist outgroup favoring men with exotic women to be loyal to traditionalist value structures. And seen as they're materialistic, they'll leap at the chance to get their woman without thinking. And then they say that sounds a lot like Islam in Britain currently. Then I say, then the local woman will indoctrinate the children and the undesirable leftist simp low quality men for some generations into higher spiritual matters, and we resolve the meaning crisis at home while we're doing it. Then I also add, in response to it sounds like Islam in Britain, I literally ripped the idea from the immigrants doing to us and said, why don't we do it to them instead? It's not like we weren't motivated in the past to do it. Why not just do a sequel except without the war? Then they ask, what do we do about populations too stupid to understand concepts like planning ahead? And I say, for those, disability subsidies and or mental health housing and or mental asylums. For those with a little planning, they would function better in less civilized places relative to here anyways, with high-tech society's abstract demands. They'd take like a fish to water on deployment when they learn the language. And then they say they literally mean Africa, not like our people. And then I say, well, the good thing is if we spread our genetics, then our intelligence gets mixed in with purity at home still. And then I mentioned my motto, lingua franca, culture franca, genus franca, the Anglos, Western Europeans, basically the one universal unifying pattern in language, culture, and genes. Not total takeover, but just one common thing spread throughout the world. Then the first person I was arguing with said they'd say I was wrong about this. The leftist undesirable men are functionally clerics of some sort of Marxism or anarchism, and their environment has made them rather emasculated. The outcome you expect is unlikely. Also, they are not materialists in everything everything can be measured sense. They are materialists in that they believe everything is downstream from material or economic conditions. Then I said, kill government aid programs to require our people to actually live there to make the foreigners better off. Incentivize welcoming our people. Our leftists will still be relatively productive in lower abstractions or technology societies more than theirs often. Sort of like Zimbabwe begging for white farmers again. Send our leftist men to do it. Honestly, I'm betting on the fact leftists embrace foreign cultures like a fetish, and that guy's complaints diagnosis of their materialism evaporates when the thing is foreign. And then they say, but leftist men won't be good workers and will preach the revolution. And then I say, then they still won't be our problem anymore either. And then the person said, until they lead a communist uprising, it becomes our problem to stop it. I said, I did say ship our undesirables, even if that means they're only someone else's problem. Like I'm concerned about some third world hellhole if all it does is take our undesirables and it remains as sucky as before. Then the first person I was arguing with said they only embrace foreign cultures on surface level because it makes them look worldly and better than their colonizer ancestors to their pretty petty cliques. And the fourth person who I was also arguing with, who I failed to mention, says fetishizing it as a form of virtue signaling might keep them embracing it. Then I say, yeah, but they'll still go over if the advertising encouraged. Then the first person I was arguing with said, that's optimistic. Then the fourth person said, thing is, Cuba and China are fetishized constantly by certain people, but there's yet to be mass exodus of leftists to those countries. Then I kind of shift tack a little bit with the three fundamentals, and then I add the fourth one. And I'm just going to read again what I said about the four fundamentals. Advance or retreat is default with neutral stalemate as a byproduct of the flip. Sacrifice, waste, or equivalent exchange are the only options. Upgrade, downgrade, side grade. There's more men than women born, and women are limiters of reproduction, so harnessing other nations for genetics using our men is good use of them, even if they're not individually as good as a Giga Chad or something. Using the foreigners, women, and our men, basically. Or a fourth one, any individual organism or group requires external resources feeding into it to keep living. And then a fifth person says that the leftist men who are undesirable are hypocrite liars who say the places are great, but they probably don't care. They know and don't care that the places lead to the West collapsing. And then I say, well, the reason is because they're low skilled or motivated, making it easier for them to acclimate or get used to and participate by a lot by having official programs to do so would lower the bar enough. It worked for the immigrants coming here. Then someone said they believe themselves the vanguardists, the leftist men do, which become the new elite rather than the ones who get purged by the new elite. And then I said, so give them a vanguard project that lets them lord over other people abroad, in foreign lands. And then someone brought up that one of the arguments for communism is apparently some people like to mow other people's lawns as a therapeutic device, or like knit lots of interesting things when they have free time. So if they had more free time or all the free time, they'd be productive that way. And then someone said, yeah, those people didn't consider the scenario of, okay, you're officially the lawnmower or knitter, now do that for 16 hours or you don't get any food. Then I kind of said, again, a little novelty and a lot of stability, a little challenge and a lot of comfort is what people like, as per what I was saying earlier. I'm very much going to have to make a video for this whole thing for my 1337 playlist, which I'm going to do, by the way. Now, faith in personal relations or psychology is missing from this particular video. This is the aggressive strategizing and metaphysical foundations of my worldview, essentially, as a video. I've made plenty of videos trying to cultivate faith and philosophy and good character already. This is more the hard, realpolitik, the hard limits, realpolitik part of it for the 1337 playlist. But yeah, this is the aggressive video, basically, which I generally try and avoid. It must be said that awakening the desire for expansion will probably default into people finding a way to push the Overton window to it. Or as they say, quote unquote, where there's a will, there's a way. Also, quote unquote, he who has a why can embrace anyhow. I purposefully picked the phrase Lebensraum of love to race mix abroad and keep purity at home, riffing off Weimar or Weimar problems resulting in Weimar solutions, but it's a much more friendly and soft approach that is more Anglo-friendly, or like friendly and soft and Anglo-specific than German brutality. With men going abroad for wives and feminism collapsing from supply and demand dynamics, patriarchy will reassert itself too, and traditional man earns, woman spends, stable households will repopulate. It did feel genuinely wrong to come up with this whole idea, the Lebensraum of love thing, because it's at the expense of other nations and civilizations' lower tier men, but it's merely doing to them what they're doing to us. But such is the limits of the human condition. If I could possibly make infinite growing access to growth without encroaching on each other, I would do that, but I recognize it's impossible for me to do so. We can alleviate most of it if we went to space successfully, But we don't have that option at the moment. So this is all based contingently on, or based on, that we haven't been able to go to space exploration and colonization big time yet. If we could do that, then this whole Lebensraum of Love thing would, I would ignore it and like throw it out the window in a heartbeat. And then I say, with patriarchy's return, Christianity will reemerge as we also cultivate those higher things I mentioned at the beginning, and in my other videos, by the way. And the genetic pool capable of sustaining those levels of thinking with the bell curve distribution improves, both globally and at home relatively. Then they say they don't see Christianity making a meaningful return unless we purge the priestly class of their secular rainbow priests. Then I say the end of imperialism signaled the decline of real Christianity, to be honest. Quote unquote, go and make disciples of the world is satisfied by my idea, and quote unquote, go forth and multiply is a commandment for reason. Refer to the four fundamentals I mentioned. And then they say the mission drive may have played a part in European expansion, but by the time you are talking about imperialism, that isn't really part of it anymore. And say, oh, it definitely was. The lack of missionary work and our people's expansion to bring it is tied together. Genes and culture expansion, one alone is not enough. Spread the genes and spread the memes. And by that point I got a headache, so that's why I stopped. It's already an hour reading it alone, not to mention thinking it through and posting, typing it up and stuff like that. But yeah, that's the conversation. I'm reasonably happy with the way it went. Like I said, the Lebensraum of Love thing I would abandon in a heartbeat if we could go to space instead of being stuck on a limited Earth, which is why I want to go to space. I'm not necessarily a eugenicist. I'm not a total Darwinian social Darwinist or something. But at the same time, even without it, there's sort of a logic to human tribes, not just tribalism, but tribes themselves, where you kind of have to be tribalistic in a limited space to not be overrun. And it's really difficult to maintain your existence if you're not expanding, because you always need new stuff essentially on some level. And because there's competitors, the more they grow, the more you shrink, and the more you grow, the more they shrink. So that's why I'm okay with the give and take back and forth of conquest, or not conquering like through warfare, but like immigration basically. But I think we've had enough of us taking them, and now we have to give to them instead. Yeah. So that's the basic. That's the basics. Yeah, I'm recording this for posterity essentially. Um, and yeah, I do recognize that it's aggressive and possibly hostile to the other nations. But at the same time, the upshot is, like I said, if our superior technologically, our superior in a technological environment, genetics seed into their natural environment selected genetics, then those places will begin to thrive on a level that they've never seen before, I suspect. So I'm not necessarily going, oh, we just want them to lose for us to win. I'm saying I want us to win so that they can win too a little bit more. At least that's how I think it would play out. I can't say for sure, so I'm not going to say for sure, but I think it might play out that way. And yes, I do think we're sort of superior in a way, and they're inferior in a certain sense, but at the same time, we're also prone to nihilism, whereas they're not. So it might be one of those things where you can argue that it's actually good to do because the expansion goal solves our nihilism, while our technological capacity and social technological IQ capacity through genetics increases theirs. in the natural dispositions that lead to cultural advancements or lack thereof, um, which leads to, if it's a cultural advancement thing, leads to objective quality of life improvements and thriving numerically as well. And that would offset the dilution of the genetics a little bit, or a lot even, by making it so that more of them exist and they have better lives. And it's genetic and cultural. So the people exist to carry the culture, but the culture exists to multiply the effects of the people natural disposition through cascades or synergies between the individuals.